Phillis Wheatley? Imagine being stolen from your homeland at age 7, enduring the horrific Middle Passage, and then being sold on a Boston dock like a piece of property, only to transform that unimaginable trauma into words so powerful they would challenge an entire nation's understanding of human dignity and intellectual capacity. In 1773, when most enslaved people were legally forbidden from learning to read, a young African woman named Phillis Wheatley became the first Black person in America to publish a book of poetry, forcing a society built on the premise of racial inferiority to confront the undeniable genius of someone they considered chattel. Her story isn't just about overcoming adversity. It's about wielding the master's own language as a weapon against the very foundations of slavery itself. Welcome to this Duel of Concepts deep dive, where we explore how one woman's extraordinary intellect and literary mastery became a catalyst for questioning everything America thought it knew about race, freedom, and human potential. Wheatley was seized from Senegal, Gambia, West Africa when she was about 7 years old, during one of history's most brutal periods of human trafficking. She was captured by a slave trader when she was 7 or 8 years old and transported across the Atlantic to America through the route known as the Middle Passage, part of the transatlantic slave trade. The traveling conditions were inhumane as slave traders tried to maximize their profits. This small child, whose African name we'll never know, endured weeks of unimaginable suffering packed into the suffocating hold of a slave ship alongside hundreds of other kidnapped Africans. Born in Africa about 1753 and sold as a slave in Boston in 1761, Phillis was a small, sick child who caught the attention of John and Susanna Wheatley. The irony is profound. Her mistress, Susanna, named her after the ship on which she had traveled. The very vessel that carried her away from everything she had ever known became her identity in this new world, a constant reminder of the violence that brought her to American shores. But the Wheatley household would prove different from the typical dynamics of New England slavery. Purchased as a domestic servant for Susanna, the small girl displayed an intellectual curiosity that caught the family's attention. Unlike most enslaved people who were deliberately kept illiterate to maintain control, the Wheatleys taught her how to read and write. Upon realizing the extent of her capabilities, John Wheatley ensured that Phillis Wheatley received an education that was extraordinary not just for an enslaved person, but for any woman in 18th century America. The first African American and one of the first women to publish a book of poetry in the colonies, Wheatley learned to read and write English by the age of 9, familiarizing herself with Latin, Greek, the Bible, and selected classics at an early age. This educational journey was remarkable in its scope and speed. Within 16 months of her arrival in Boston, she was not only literate but reading complex religious and classical texts that challenged many educated white colonists. The young prodigy's intellectual appetite seemed insatiable. She devoured the works of Alexander Pope, whose heroic couplets would profoundly influence her poetic style. She studied Milton's Paradise Lost, finding in its epic scope a model for her own spiritual and literary aspirations. The Bible became both her spiritual foundation and a source of rich imagery and metaphor that would permeate her poetry. She also engaged with Latin classics, developing a sophisticated understanding of meter, rhythm, and classical allusion that would distinguish her work from contemporary American poetry. She began writing poetry at 13, and these early verses revealed a mind grappling with profound questions of identity, spirituality, and place in a society that simultaneously celebrated and enslaved her. Her first published poem appeared in 1767, when she was just 14 years old, addressing the death of a prominent minister. This elegiac poem established patterns that would characterize much of her work: classical form, Christian themes, and subtle but persistent challenges to assumptions about African intellectual capacity. Her poetry quickly gained attention throughout New England's literary circles. In an era when American literature was still finding its voice, Wheatley's sophisticated verses stood out for their technical mastery and philosophical depth. She wrote elegies for prominent figures, occasional poems celebrating significant events, and deeply personal meditations on faith, identity, and the human condition. But it was her 1768 poem, On Being Brought from Africa to America, that would become her most famous and controversial work. She is best known today for her poem, On Being Brought from Africa to America, was 1768. The poem's opening lines, "'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land," have been debated by scholars for centuries. Some critics have interpreted this as acceptance of slavery's justifications, while others recognize it as a masterful example of subversive rhetoric that uses Christian language to challenge white supremacist assumptions. The poem's conclusion reveals its true power. Remember, Christians, Negroes, black as Cain, may be refined and join the angelic train. In just 8 lines, Wheatley accomplishes something revolutionary. She inserts African Americans into the Christian narrative of salvation while simultaneously challenging the racial prejudices of her white Christian readers. The word remember functions as both reminder and warning, suggesting that those who claim Christian faith must acknowledge the spiritual equality of all people. As her reputation grew, so did questions about her authorship. The idea that an enslaved African woman could produce such sophisticated poetry challenged fundamental assumptions about race and intelligence that undergirded the entire slavery system. In 1773, with financial support from the English Countess of Huntingdon, Wheatley traveled to London with the Wheatley Sun to publish her first collection of poems on various subjects, religious and moral, the first book written by an enslaved black woman in America. The journey to London represented both triumph and tragedy. While her intellectual achievements were celebrated by British abolitionists and literary figures, she remained legally enslaved. The contradiction was stark. She was simultaneously honored as a literary genius and owned as property. Her visit to London coincided with growing abolitionist sentiment in Britain, and her very presence became a powerful argument against slavery's justifications. On September 1, 1773, Phillis Wheatley's poems on various subjects, religious and moral, was published in London, England. Wheatley's collection was the first volume of poetry by an African-American poet to be published. 2023 marks the 250th anniversary of Phillis Wheatley's Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral, the first book of poetry published by an enslaved poet, and only the third by an American woman. This achievement cannot be overstated. In a world where most women and virtually all enslaved people were denied literacy, Wheatley had not only mastered the written word, but achieved international literary recognition. The book's publication required extraordinary validation. 18 prominent Boston men, including John Hancock, had to sign an attestation confirming that the poems were indeed written by a young Negro girl who was but a few years since brought an uncultivated barbarian from Africa. This document reveals the profound disbelief that greeted her achievement. Society literally could not accept that an African woman possessed such intellectual capabilities without official verification. Her poetry during this period engaged with the major political and social questions of her time. She wrote elegies for prominent figures, occasional poems celebrating American resistance to British taxation, and deeply personal meditations on faith and identity. Her poem, To the University of Cambridge in New England, addressed Harvard students, positioning herself as their moral instructor while subtly challenging assumptions about who could claim intellectual authority. The American Revolution created new opportunities and challenges for Wheatley. Phillis Wheatley was the first globally recognized African-American female poet. She came to prominence during the American Revolutionary period and is understood today for her fervent commitment to abolitionism, as her international fame brought her into correspondence with leading abolitionists. Her poem to George Washington, written in 1775, demonstrated her engagement with revolutionary politics while maintaining her focus on moral and spiritual themes. Washington's response to her poem, he invited her to visit him at his headquarters, represented unprecedented recognition of an African American's intellectual contributions to American political discourse. Yet the contradiction remained stark. While revolutionary leaders celebrated freedom and natural rights, they maintained a system of bondage that denied those same rights to hundreds of thousands of people. After returning from London, Wheatley's life became increasingly difficult. The Wheatley family began to dissolve. Her master John died in 1778, and her mistress Susanna died in 1774, shortly after manumitting Phillis. Freedom brought new challenges. Without the Wheatley family's support and protection, she faced the harsh realities of being a free black woman in a society that offered few opportunities for economic independence. She married John Peters, a free black man living in Boston, and the couple had 3 children, 2 of whom may have died in infancy. By 1784, Wheatley was living in a boarding house, and in December of that year, both she and her 3rd child passed away. Their burial place is unknown. Her final years were marked by poverty and struggle, a stark contrast to her earlier literary fame. She continued writing, attempting to publish a second volume of poetry, but could not secure adequate financial support. The tragedy of Wheatley's later life reflects broader patterns of how American society treated free Black people in the Revolutionary era. Despite her international reputation and undeniable talents, she found few opportunities to support herself through her writing. The same society that had celebrated her genius when she was an exotic novelty largely abandoned her when she needed practical support as a free woman. Early 20th century critics of Black American literature were not very kind to Wheatley Peters because of her supposed lack of concern about slavery. This criticism reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of her historical context and literary strategies. Writing as an enslaved person in Revolutionary-era Boston, Wheatley could not openly attack slavery without endangering herself and potentially other enslaved people. Instead, she employed sophisticated rhetorical strategies that challenged slavery's foundations while maintaining plausible deniability. Modern scholars have recognized the complexity and courage of Wheatley's approach. Her poetry consistently asserted African intellectual equality, challenged racial stereotypes, and insisted on the spiritual worth of all people regardless of race. These themes, woven throughout her work, represented fundamental challenges to slavery's ideological justifications, even when expressed through Christian and classical frameworks. Her influence on later African American literature cannot be overstated. Critics consider her work fundamental to the genre of African American literature, and she is honored as the first African American woman to publish a book of poetry and the first to make a living from her writing. She established literary traditions and themes that would resonate through centuries of African American writing: the tension between Christian faith and social injustice, the power of literacy as resistance, and the complex negotiations required to challenge oppression while surviving within oppressive systems. Writers from Frederick Douglass to Maya Angelou have acknowledged Wheatley's pioneering role in creating space for African American voices in American literature. Her technical mastery demonstrated that African Americans could excel in European literary forms, while her thematic concerns established enduring patterns in African American literary expression. The global impact of Wheatley's achievement extended far beyond American shores. European abolitionists used her poetry as evidence against slavery's defenders, who claimed Africans lacked intellectual capacity. Her work was translated into multiple languages and circulated throughout the Atlantic world, contributing to growing international pressure against the slave trade and slavery itself. Her correspondence with prominent figures reveals the breadth of her intellectual engagement. She exchanged letters with ministers, political leaders, and fellow writers throughout America and Europe. These letters demonstrate her sophisticated understanding of theology, politics, and literature, as well as her skill in navigating complex social dynamics as an enslaved and later free Black woman in predominantly white intellectual circles. The religious dimensions of Wheatley's poetry deserve particular attention. Her deep engagement with Christian themes reflected both personal faith and strategic positioning. Christianity provided her with a universalist framework that could challenge racial hierarchies while remaining acceptable to white audiences. Her poems frequently emphasize the spiritual equality of all people before God, a message that implicitly undermined slavery's justifications. Her use of classical references and forms also served strategic purposes. By demonstrating mastery of European literary traditions, she challenged assumptions about African intellectual inferiority. Her sophisticated deployment of classical allusions, complex meter, and elegant diction forced readers to confront the contradiction between their beliefs about racial hierarchy and the evidence of her literary achievement. The question of authenticity that plagued Wheatley during her lifetime continues to inform scholarly discussions of her work. The requirement for white attestation of her authorship reveals the profound disbelief that greeted African intellectual achievement. This skepticism reflected deeper anxieties about slavery's moral and intellectual foundations. If Africans could produce sophisticated poetry, what justification remained for their enslavement? Contemporary scholars have moved beyond questions of authenticity to examine Wheatley's work within its historical and literary contexts. Her poetry emerges as a complex negotiation with the constraints and opportunities of her unique position as an enslaved intellectual in revolutionary America. Rather than viewing her work as either accommodating or resistant to slavery, modern criticism recognizes the sophisticated ways she challenged oppression while surviving within oppressive systems. The feminist dimensions of Wheatley's achievement also deserve recognition. As one of the first American women to publish poetry, she faced gender as well as racial barriers. Her literary career established precedents for women's intellectual authority, while navigating expectations about feminine propriety and submission. Her success opened doors for later generations of women writers, while demonstrating the particular challenges faced by women of color in claiming intellectual authority. Educational initiatives throughout America now use Wheatley's poetry to teach about colonial history, the development of American literature, and the complex negotiations required to challenge injustice. Her work appears in anthologies, school curricula, and scholarly conferences, ensuring her voice continues to reach new generations of readers. The location of Wheatley's grave remains unknown, but her literary legacy provides a more lasting monument. Streets, schools, and literary prizes bear her name, acknowledging her foundational role in American letters. These commemorations represent growing recognition of her achievements and their continuing relevance to contemporary discussions of race, literature, and social justice. Modern poets and writers continue to engage with Wheatley's themes and example. Her negotiation of identity, faith, and resistance within constraining circumstances speaks to ongoing struggles for recognition and equality. Her demonstration that literary excellence could challenge social hierarchies remains relevant to artists seeking to use their work for social change. The digital age has made Wheatley's complete works more accessible than ever before, allowing new generations to discover her sophisticated poetry and complex intellectual legacy. Online databases, digitized manuscripts, and scholarly websites provide unprecedented access to her poems, letters, and contemporary documents, facilitating new research and interpretation. International interest in Wheatley continues to grow as scholars recognize her significance to Atlantic world studies and the global history of slavery and resistance. Her work appears in comparative studies of colonial literature, examinations of early abolitionist thought, and investigations of how enslaved people used literacy as resistance. The complexity of Wheatley's legacy reflects the broader complexities of American history itself. Her story encompasses the violence of slavery, the power of education, the possibilities and limitations of literary achievement, and the ongoing struggle for recognition and equality. She achieved unprecedented success while navigating extraordinary constraints, leaving a body of work that continues to challenge and inspire readers more than 2 centuries after her death. Her poetry remains remarkably relevant to contemporary discussions about identity, belonging, and justice. Her sophisticated engagement with questions of faith, race, and citizenship anticipates themes that continue to resonate in American literature and society. Her example demonstrates both the power of individual achievement and the systemic barriers that constrain such achievement. If this exploration of Phillis Wheatley's revolutionary life has revealed how one woman's mastery of language became a weapon against the very system that enslaved her, don't let her story end here in the margins where history too often tries to contain voices that threaten comfortable narratives. Hit that like button if this journey through America's first published African-American poet has challenged your understanding of who gets to claim intellectual authority and under what circumstances. Subscribe to Duel of Concepts for more investigations into the figures whose achievements forced societies to confront their own contradictions, and share in the comments which aspect of Wheatley's story most powerfully demonstrates the connection between literacy and liberation. Her transformation from kidnapped child to celebrated poet, her strategic use of Christian themes to challenge racial hierarchies, or perhaps the tragic irony that the same society that celebrated her genius ultimately abandoned her to poverty and obscurity. Because in a world where the power to define intelligence, worthiness, and humanity remains contested, Phillis Wheatley's legacy reminds us that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply proving that brilliance knows no boundaries, even when the world insists otherwise.
10 seconds for missing out. This deep dive could change your mind. Act fast, like, subscribe, and comment your take before the debate evolves.